home race heartbreak, a disaster for Ferrari, and just a tiny bit of chaos. This week I'm chatting all about the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, so get ready because you've been summoned to the steward's office. Hello everyone and welcome back to the steward's office. I'm Saira, and this week F1 headed out to one of my favourite racetracks, Interlagos, for the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. It was a sprint weekend as well, and Interlagos has hosted a sprint weekend every year since sprints became a thing in F1, and normally I don't actually mind them when we go to Interlagos. It kind of lends itself quite well to the sprint format. This weekend though was messy, like messy, all in capital letters, messy. There is just so much to cover over this weekend, but before we head on to the on-track actions, because there was a lot, we did get news that Franco Colapinto has officially extended his contract with Alpine for the 2026 season. They announced it just before the weekend started. I am chuffed for Franco, and yeah, Alpine seemed to be happy with the progress he's made over the last couple of races. Flavio seems to be happy with it too, and I think for them they were looking for a bit of stability coming in to 2026 when the regulations change and they move to a new engine manufacturer in Mercedes. I do think that continuity will help them. Whether or not the car is great and the drivers can do anything with it is a different thing altogether, but I'm hoping this means that there's a little less pressure on Franco's shoulders and that he's able to kind of just focus on racing and driving now without thinking what's going to happen to his seat next year. But yeah, super good news for Franco Colapinto and Franco Colapinto fans. Let's dive into this weekend though, guys. Honestly, I finished up clearing up my notes after the race, right, for the whole weekend, and there was just so much that went on. And I know that sprint weekends tend to be a little bit messier because there's so much going on, because it's not just 3 practice sessions. Interlagos just served so much chaos. Let's start with sprint quali, which is probably the best place for us to start, right? Yuki Tsunoda, we're gonna kick off with him in sprint quali. This poor guy who lost a load of time in the only free practice session that we had just because he ended up spinning, had some damage to the car, and they had to repair that. So he was in the garage for a while in free practice. And I'm gonna say this wasn't just a Yuki problem. The Red Bull looked a handful over free practice, and to be fair, for most of the weekend. And Max had the same sort of snaps in that same section of track, but Yuki just wasn't able to save the car, and it did cause damage. He ended up out in SQ1, and I do think partly because he had a lack of running and wasn't able to get to grips with the track and the car very well and into a setup that he might have wanted going into sprint quali, so that was him out. Carlos Sainz, my gosh, that man was not happy with Williams. He has had a love-hate relationship with this team since he has joined, because there have been incredible highs where, yeah, he's qualifying well, the race results have been amazing, and then there have been points where I think he would happily tear his hair out over what has happened with the team. I just think he was so fed up in SQ1. He could not get tyre prep the way that he wanted to. He was locking up. He couldn't get the entries into the corners right. His final outlap in SQ1, he was caught up in so much traffic that tyre prep fell out a window, exited in SQ1, and my gosh, his radio afterwards was like, yeah, this is the worst execution I have seen in my life. Don't hold back, Carlos. I mean, say what you gotta say. Part of the reason they definitely brought Carlos Sainz into that team is the wealth of experience that he has in Formula One. And he's never been someone to shy away from telling the team how he feels, whether that's on the radio or in an engineering meeting. And we saw it in Ferrari where he had to call his own strategy. And to be fair, yeah, he was having to get out of the way of cars. He was having to get past other cars that were slow moving on his outlap. So I don't necessarily blame him for being unhappy. In the end though, we had Lando Norris on pole, then it was Kimi Antonelli, Oscar Piastri, George Russell, and then Fernando Alonso. Fernando Alonso in P5, and it was a really good qualifying for him for the sprint, and the car really came alive. And to be fair, the cons said this over sprint quali, that the problem with Aston Martin is that it is a one-trick pony and that it seems to only suit certain tracks, but in sprint quality, Interlagos looked like it was going to be one of those tracks where Aston would be able to get some kind of good result from. Going into the sprint race though, right, we had rain just a few hours before the sprint happened. I thought it was going to be way worse than what they had on track, because there were warnings about a cyclone, there were warnings that it was going to be quite torrential rain, and that, yeah, the winds were going to be quite bad. But to be fair, at Interlagos, at least on the track, it wasn't awful. Yeah, there was water on the track and it was pooled in some places, but wasn't as bad as I think most of us thought it was going to be. It wasn't wet enough that any of the drivers were on wet weather tyres, but what an absolute disaster for Oscar Piastri. I gasped, audibly gasped, when I saw Oscar Piastri go into a barrier. He went over a curb, got caught in some of the pooled water, spun into a barrier, completely ended his race, and it's just added to a bad run of results recently for Oscar Piastri. It was awful. On top of that though, so Oscar spins, goes off into a wall. They pan out a few seconds later and I see Hülkenberg and Colapinto only a few meters away from him, and I was like, did they somehow all collide? Nope, they all made the exact same mistake and all managed to spin off in that same area. And thankfully, no one was hurt, which is always the main thing. Honestly, though, 3 of the cars in the same spot. For Colapinto and Oscar, that was sprint over. They weren't going to be going anywhere. Hülkenberg somehow managed to spin his car around and keep going. And I'm not quite sure how he managed to have that happen, but good on him. Did cause a red flag though, which I think, one, fair enough, because you have people on track between the marshals and the drivers, as well as trying to get the cars off track, and also in a sprint there would have been absolutely no point. The amount of time that safety car would have been out for, and then add on to the fact that, yeah, we don't have that many laps anyway, it would have been pointless. So I do understand why they called a red flag. Gabriel Bortoleto though, when we went back racing right at the end of the sprint as well, right, had such a huge crash at the end. Oh my gosh, I don't think we've seen a crash that big in a little while, and thankfully he was okay. He got cleared by medical and everything, so he was absolutely fine with no injuries, which is always the main thing. The state of that car was an absolute wreck though. It was awful. His sprint race was over and I felt gutted for him, because this was his first home race, his first time racing in Interlagos as an F1 driver, and you could tell and see how excited the crowds were for him. His family were in the garage, his other half. So I was absolutely gutted that his sprint ended like that, and the amount of damage to that car did end up meaning that when we went to qualifying, the mechanics were absolutely racing to get that car ready. Norris ended up winning the sprint race. It didn't really seem in doubt. There were certain points, I think, after the red flag where it looked like, okay, maybe Antonelli could catch up and fight for that win. I think Lando pretty much had it in control the entire way though. Let's head into qualifying. It was delayed a little bit because I think it's a Porsche Super Cup that was running beforehand. There was an incident in that race. They had to repair the barriers. It did give the Sauber mechanics a little bit more time to work on Gabriel Bortoleto's car. It just wasn't enough time. There was no way they were able to get that fully completed and done in time for him to go out. And the worst part for Gabby, I think, was the car was actually looking in a pretty decent state by the time quali had started, and towards the end he'd had his helmet on, he was talking to his race engineer, he was fully like kitted out, ready to get back in the car. I think he was actually in the car at one point, but they couldn't get it started up in time to then go out and have him take part in qualifying, which was gut-wrenching for him because he was going to be starting in P20. And for Gabby, look, I think he's had such amazing qualifyings this season. There have been points where it's not been great, where the Sauber's not been great, or he's made a mistake. But there have been, especially recently, really, really good qualifyings from him. And I was gutted that we couldn't see that kind of performance in Interlagos for him, and I know he would have loved that to have happened. But when we look at the 19 cars that were able to take part in quali, guys, I don't understand what I was watching this weekend. Yuki Tsunoda out in Q1 with that second Red Bull car. We've seen Yuki out in Q1, so that, okay, fine, I can deal with that. That's not a problem. Max Verstappen out in Q1, not what I was expecting. The car was once again awful. They essentially used Yuki in the sprint, right, as a little guinea pig setup wise. They had him start from the pit lane, they changed the setup on the car, and it seemed like they were happy with the setup that Yuki had on his car for the sprint. I'm pretty sure they then applied some of that to Max's car, which is fair enough, but it just didn't seem to be working for either of them when it came to qualifying. And yeah, Max qualified in P17, which is insane. And I don't necessarily think there are any major mistakes, but there was no pace in that car. I don't know what Red Bull did. I don't know what happened when it came to sort of matching things up with the simulations, but it did not work out for them in quali. So that was a huge, huge shock. We had Lewis then out in Q2. He didn't have any pace and could not get the rear tyres to warm up at all. And there's not much you can really do at that point because you can't change setup. You're back in Parc Ferme, and it cost him a lot of lap time. Fernando Alonso also couldn't get out of Q2. He got eliminated in Q2 as well, and just the consistency, Aston Martin, I am begging you. This man was in the top 5 in sprint quali and then couldn't even get to Q3 for qualifying in the actual race. I am begging for a little bit of consistency for this man. I tell you what was consistent though, Lando Norris on pole position and then Kimi Antonelli starting alongside him for qualifying. My absolute star of qualifying though, guys, and I'm so happy to talk about this. It is Ollie Behrman. Oh my gosh, I was just in awe of what he was doing in qualifying. He was top in the timesheets at certain points. He put in some brilliant laps, got into Q3, and look, he didn't start in the top 3 like I was hoping he would, and maybe okay, yep, that was a far cry and it wasn't realistic for me to think it was going to happen, but I just think he put in an absolutely amazing performance the entire way through qualifying with that Haas, and it was just brilliant to watch. And he is just a driver I'm so excited to see develop over the next couple of years in Formula One, because he has really grown into his own over the course of his rookie year. And yeah, qualifying was brilliant to watch. Let's head in to the actual race though, guys, because yeah, all of that's happened before the actual Grand Prix. Kicking off with all of our championship leaders though, and it was a pretty perfect weekend for Lando Norris. I don't know how it could have gotten much better for him. Both pole positions, he won the sprint, he won the race. I mean, he wasn't necessarily really facing issues from anyone during the race either. On the radio after the race, though, I think he still said to his race engineer, look, there are still a couple of things that we could improve on because it wasn't great, it wasn't perfect. But, I mean, from an outside perspective, yes, operationally, there are going to be certain things that he's going to want to go over with the team and the team are going to want to talk about with him. But from the outside, it was a really clean weekend from him. I mean, he's extended his championship lead even more. It's a bit more of a comfortable position for him to be in going into the final 3 races of the season. And then there is his teammate Oscar Piastri, who's still in P2 in the championship, but whereas we ended last weekend with only a point difference, that point difference has definitely expanded after this sprint weekend. He finished behind Lando in both the race and the sprint, which does not help. It has been a pretty awful weekend for Oscar Piastri, and okay, look, it could have been worse. He did at least finish in the points for the Grand Prix, but walked away with nothing from the sprint. And there was the opportunity for the race to be so much better. Oscar didn't end up on the podium. He ended up finishing in P5, which is quite a drop in terms of the amount of points compared to his teammate, right? At this point, it does feel like that championship is slowly slipping away from Oscar. It's been a series of bad weekends, some mistakes, DNFs, just points that could have been a lot better, but he wasn't able to capitalize on. And it does look like it's kind of swinging way more towards Lando Norris at this point. And the reason I think, the points this weekend could have been better is because of that 10-second time penalty he ended up having. There was an incident that happened after the safety car towards the start of the race where he locked up, went into Kimi Antonelli, who then went into Charles Leclerc, who lost a tyre, broke his front suspension and had to retire from the race. 10 seconds was a massive amount of time to lose when you're in the pit lane. Without it, definitely think he could have been on the podium. But he was having to fight what was essentially a losing battle at that point and just try and get as high as he could within the race to walk away with as many points as was possible. I did think potentially at one point, right, maybe he could fight the Mercedes, both of them, and get into like a podium, but it just wasn't meant to happen. He finished in P5, which, like I said, not awful, but it could have been better. We are getting to a point where I think Max seems to be catching up with Oscar, and Oscar's not really catching up with Lando Norris, so he's fighting a battle on both sides, both to chase and defend at this point, and that's not a comfortable place to be in. But let's have a chat about Max Verstappen, who just, oh my gosh, the weekend this man had was incredible. Max Verstappen qualified in P17. The team decided to change the setup and his engine, broke parc fermé, and he was going to be starting from the pit lane. And he had kind of written off the race when he had qualified that low, and he'd written off the championship when the commentators and the presenters had asked him about it before the race. I was like, we're starting from the pit lane. I can't really think about a championship fight. And look, this race was not exactly straightforward for him. He ended up in about P13 by the time we got to the VSC towards the beginning of the race, right? Made up an insane amount of spaces from the pit lane. He ended up having to pit with a suspected puncture, which I think was probably down to some of the debris that we had on the track, caused him to fall right to the back of the field again. That man fought his way from the back of the field all the way up to P3 and was even fighting for P2 and had led the race at some points. I don't even know what you say at that point, because there are very few drivers that have made it from the pit lane up to a podium. It was an incredible drive from him, a brilliant race. He was so chuffed with that result. I don't think anyone would be in his position. And look, love them or hate them, Red Bull and Max Verstappen know how to execute a race, to win a championship, to get on the podium, to chase down a championship. The execution that team has is insane, and it's something that I think a lot of the other teams do sometimes struggle with, and we've seen that recently with some other teams, but Red Bull managed to pull it all together. Max did an absolutely incredible job, and if he hadn't had to pit again for that puncture, I do think he could have been in with a chance to win the race, because the driving was incredible. Whatever Red Bull did to change the setup on that car definitely worked out for him, and incredible race from Max Verstappen. Let's have a chat about that Constructors' Championship really quickly though, because that battle for P2 to P4 at the moment is really still on, let's be honest, okay? We're going to push Mercedes aside for a moment, still in P2. Kimi Antonelli finished on the podium, George Russell in P4. It was a really good weekend for Mercedes, so we're going to pop them aside because not much to report on there. Max Verstappen's result allowed Red Bull, though, to get to P3 in the championship, which is insane because they were a team that were lagging behind massively compared to Mercedes and Ferrari in the championship. But a run of incredible results from Max recently has caused them to be in that fight for P2 again, which I am still trying to understand, guys. Like, I've watched this season and I've got a spreadsheet of all the races and the Constructors' Championship and everything, and I'm still trying to fathom how they've managed that comeback. It is insane. But yeah, for Red Bull, now P3 in the championship, it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next couple of races. We are going to have a bit of an in-depth chat about Ferrari though. Ferrari, who are now P4 in the Constructors' Championship. And you know what? I saw a post online and they were like, this does reflect the car better. And I've got to agree, because I don't know how they managed to hold on to P2 for as long as they did. And I'm not quite sure how they even managed to be in P3. P4 does feel more like Ferrari's season as a whole. You know, neither driver managed to finish the race. Lewis Hamilton had an absolute nightmare from the start. He went from P13 all the way down from P18 in the opening lap. And it was such a far cry from the start that he had in the sprint, where he, I think, started P11. I think it was roughly around the same space he was starting for the race, up to P7 when he finished. So yeah, was quite the opposite start. He had a small bit of contact with Carlos Sainz. He then nicked the Alpine when he was trying to overtake. He was just a bit too close. That caused his front wing to break and go underneath his car, and it wrecked Lewis's floor, essentially. He said he lost 30 to 40 points of downforce, and you could tell that car would not stick. He also had a 5-second time penalty for that collision with Franco Colapinto in the Alpine that caused the front wing to break. And it did get to a point where Lewis was on the radio like, I'm gonna crash out if we keep doing this race because I can't control the car properly. Eventually, they did retire him, thankfully, but an absolute nightmare for Lewis when he adores coming to Brazil and he loves the Sao Paulo GP. And then for Charles Leclerc, like I mentioned, you got caught up in that incident with Oscar Piastri and Kimi Antonelli. Front suspension broke and retired from the race really early on. So this was such a nightmare for Ferrari. I don't even know what to say anymore. I can't say that they're gonna end up finishing any higher than P4 at this point. I can't see the next 3 races necessarily going well for the team. This, don't get me wrong, was literally the worst nightmare they could have had with a double DNF, but I can't exactly see them scoring big in the last 3 races of the season. So I think P4 is where we're settling with Ferrari, which is gutting, but here we are, and are we really surprised? Chat about the midfield battle, because Ollie Behrman just had a wonderful race. He finished in P6. Then he said in his post-race interview, look, yeah, I wish I kind of hadn't finished in P4 last race, because yeah, P6 just looks normal, but it's actually a really, really good result, and it is, especially for Haas, especially for a rookie in the Haas. He should be absolutely chuffed with that. Alpine with Pierre Gasly managed to score a point, and just in general there was some brilliant midfield racing. I think we saw some battles with Ollie Behrman and Nico Hülkenberg that was so cool to watch. Fernando Alonso, though, down in P14. Yeah, we started the weekend genuinely thinking this might be a decent weekend for Aston Martin, and it just didn't happen. Both of the Aston Martins ended up out of the points. On the flip side, both V-Carbs in the points. They had a brilliant race. Liam Lawson and Isaac Hadjar still fighting to keep P6 in the championship. Aston Martin are about 10 points behind them. Haas are 12 points, and then Sauber are like 20 points behind them. So it's still kind of tight. And I think it will depend with teams like Aston Martin. Do you know what, with all of these teams, just if the next couple of races suit the car. But this definitely did help out Visa Cash App RB, I think, having that double points finish, and with Aston Martin not scoring anything. There was a little bit more chaos though that didn't fit in any of these sections, so let's run through that. Had a couple more penalties, couple more issues. Gabriel Bortoleto's weekend somehow got worse, guys, and honestly, I can't. My heart really does break for this guy, because he crashed in the sprint. He couldn't take part in qualifying. And then in the opening laps of the race, he got squeezed by Lance Stroll, went onto the grass and spun out. And that was the end of his race. I'm not even sure we definitely didn't get into double figure laps with him, which is absolutely gutting. He was tearing up in the pit lane, which honestly, I'm not surprised, because it's gut-wrenching. He was hugging his grandmother crying, and I can't, guys. Like, it broke my heart watching that clip. Oh my God, guys, like, my heart cannot cope. And then we had Yuki Tsunoda, who just just bad. It was bad. He got a 10-second time penalty for causing a collision with Lance Stroll, which I did think was a little bit harsh, okay? He got caught out by some of the braking, going into a corner, kind of nicked the back of Stroll's car, which then spun. And bear in mind, Stroll did manage to carry on. It wasn't a DNF. But they gave Yuki a 10-second time penalty for that. Yuki went into the pit lane, served the 10-second time penalty, came back out, got noted for not serving that 10-second time penalty correctly, and then got another 10-second time penalty for that. His race was basically done at that point, because what do you even do when you've essentially had 20 seconds worth of time penalties added on? We're still waiting on news for that second Red Bull seat. At this point, I just don't want anyone in it. I'm concerned about anyone that takes that seat. So if we just keep everyone away, maybe Red Bull could just field one car for next season, because it is concerning me, whoever gets that seat. Let's head into the winners and losers from this weekend before I finish up though. And look, Lando Norris obviously top of the list for winning the sprint and the Grand Prix and still leading the championship and extending that championship. Also on that list is Max Verstappen, pit lane to podium. I mean, that was an incredible drive from him, and I know the rest of the weekend might not have panned out the way he wanted, but I think you can forget about all of that when you look at his racing in the Grand Prix. And I don't think it's going to surprise you guys that Ollie Behrman is also on my list. P6, an amazing qualifying for him, and yeah, an incredible weekend. My losers though for this weekend, and these won't also surprise you guys, kicking off with Gabriel Bortoleto. What else do I say that I haven't said, guys? It's just heartbreaking, and I hope next year goes better for him in Sao Paulo. Ferrari are also on that list from their double DNF. I mean, yeah, double DNF and down to P4. And finally, Oscar Piastri, who is having to now fend off Max Verstappen from taking P2 and fight an even bigger points deficit to Lando Norris in the championship, and also just has to find a way to get over what has happened over the last couple of races and get into a better mindset. So yeah, that is my winners and losers from a pretty chaotic Sao Paulo Grand Prix. It's a week break before F1 come back for the final triple header of the season, which always just, it's a weird one, guys, to do Vegas, Qatar, Abu Dhabi in a triple header. And I get Qatar and Abu Dhabi being a double header. Vegas, the time difference there, just, I'm not comfortable with that for anyone that's having to work in Formula 1, but here we are. But thank you guys so much for listening, and diolch yn fawr. Make sure you find me on Instagram and on TikTok at Stewards_office, and I will see you guys next time you're summoned to the Stewards office.